Chapter 5. Jane Fairfax. It was now February. Emma soon gave Mr. Knightley the news that Jane was coming to Highbury. "I am pleased to hear it," Mr. Knightley said. "She will be a better friend for you than Harriet Smith. You do not like Jane because she is better educated than you, Emma. She reads many more books, and she plays the piano better than you do. She is a very beautiful and a very clever young woman." "Yes, but she is so cold," Emma had replied. "I do not enjoy her company. It is difficult to talk to Jane Fairfax. I never know what she is thinking. Her aunt talks too much, and Jane Fairfax does not talk enough." But when Jane arrived in Highbury, Emma felt that she had been very unkind to her. Jane was tall, and she had a good figure. She had beautiful dark grey eyes and dark brown hair. Her skin was pale, and she had a lovely complexion. Everyone agreed that Miss Fairfax was very charming. Emma decided to be more friendly towards the beautiful girl, and she soon invited Jane, Mrs. Bates, and Miss Bates to spend the evening at Hartfield. But after one evening, Emma's unkind feelings about Jane Fairfax returned. Emma decided that she did not want to see Jane again. She had asked Jane many questions about the Dixons, but Jane's answers were very short, and they did not give Emma much information. Then Emma found out that Jane had met Frank Churchill in Weymouth. "You have met Mr. Frank Churchill, Miss Fairfax? You are so lucky," Emma cried. "Everyone in Highbury wants to see Mr. Frank Churchill. Is he handsome?" "People think that he is," Jane replied. "And does he talk well? What about his manners and his conversation?" "People say that his manners are good," Jane said quietly, but she refused to give an opinion of her own. The next morning Mr. Knightley came to speak to Mr. Woodhouse about business. Mr. Knightley had also been at Hartfield the previous evening. He began to talk with Emma about her guests. "I had a very pleasant time last night," Mr. Knightley said. "You and Jane gave us some good music, Emma, and you gave us some good conversation." Emma smiled. "Jane certainly plays the piano very well," she said. "But her conversation is not interesting. Jane said very little all the evening. She did not answer any of my questions. She is not good company." Mr. Knightley looked unhappy. "I would like you to be friends with Jane," he said. "Jane does not make friends easily," Emma replied. "But she is very beautiful and very charming. I admire her, but I feel sorry for her too. Her life will not be easy, like mine." Mr. Knightley was pleased at Emma's words, but Mr. Woodhouse looked sad. "The Bateses do not have an easy life either," he said. "They have very little money. I wish that we could do more for them, Emma, my dear. Ah, we have just killed one of our pigs here at Hartfield. Perhaps we could send Miss Bates some of the meat." "Papa, do not worry," Emma said. "I have already sent a large piece of the pork to Miss and Mrs. Bates's house." Mr. Knightley was about to speak when the sitting-room door opened and Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax came in. "Oh, Miss Woodhouse," Miss Bates cried, "we have come to thank you for the piece of pork. You are so very kind. And we have some news to tell you. You will never believe it, but Mr. Elton is to be married. Yes, married. He is getting married to Miss Augusta Hawkins of Bath. We shall all have a new neighbour at Highbury. What do you think about that, Miss Woodhouse?" "I am sure that everyone will wish Mr. Elton happiness," Emma said quietly. "And Miss Hawkins too, of course." Emma turned towards Jane Fairfax. "What do you think about the news, Miss Fairfax?" "I do not know Mr. Elton, so I can have no opinion," Jane replied. "And Mr. Elton has only been away 4 weeks," Miss Bates said. "I did think at one time, perhaps a young lady in Highbury, but no, Mr. Elton is a fine young man. Well, Jane," Miss Bates went on, "we must be going now. Your grandmamma will be waiting for us. She will be worried. I think that it is going to rain. Oh, Mr. Knightley, are you leaving too? Goodbye, Mr. Woodhouse, and dear Miss Woodhouse. Mr. Elton, marrying Miss Hawkins. She will be Mrs. Elton, a new neighbour. It is so exciting." A few minutes after this, the rain began to fall heavily. As soon as the rain had stopped, Emma had another visitor. "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think has happened?" Harriet cried as she ran into the room. Emma thought that her friend had heard about Mr. Elton. But that news would have made Harriet upset. Harriet looked very happy. "I was in Mrs. Ford's shop in Highbury when they came in," Harriet went on. "I did not know what to do." "What do you mean? Who came in?" Emma asked her friend. "Why, Elizabeth Martin and her brother, of course," Harriet replied. "I did not know what to do. I could not leave the shop, because it was raining hard. Then Elizabeth came to talk to me, and she was so kind. Mr. Robert Martin spoke to me too. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, I was so happy when he spoke to me. Now I do not know what to think. Please help me." At first, Emma had no answer. "The Martins behaved well," she said after a few minutes. "And you did too, Harriet. It was very difficult for you, but it is over now. You must stop thinking about that meeting. You will never see the Martins here at Hartfield. It may be months before you see them again." "Yes, of course, dear Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said sadly. "And now I have news for you," Emma said. The news about Mr. Elton's engagement was a shock for Harriet. She stopped talking about the Martins at once. All her conversation was now about Miss Hawkins of Bath. Mr. Elton loved Miss Hawkins, so she must be very beautiful. 2 days later, the Westons saw Emma walking by herself in Highbury. They stopped their carriage and began to talk to her. "We were coming to Hartfield to tell you the news," Mrs. Weston said. "Frank Churchill will be here tomorrow." "Yes, Frank is coming at last," said Mr. Weston. "Here is his letter. He will be here tomorrow at about 3 o'clock. He is staying for 2 weeks. I shall be so happy to have Frank with us at Randalls," Mrs. Weston said. "We shall bring him to Hartfield very soon, Emma." But Frank Churchill surprised everyone. He arrived a day early. By 12 o'clock the following morning, Mr. Weston and Frank Churchill were talking with Mr. Woodhouse in the sitting room at Hartfield. As soon as Emma came into the sitting room, Mr. Weston introduced Frank to her. Emma saw a tall and very handsome young man who had very good manners. Frank Churchill was also a very good talker. He had ideas and opinions about everything. Emma was soon enjoying his company very much. "I believe that I know a neighbour of yours, Miss Woodhouse," Frank Churchill said. "The lady's name is Fairfax, but the family's name is Barnes or Bates, I think. Do you know them?" "We all know the Bateses. They are our good friends," Mr. Weston said. "You met Jane Fairfax in Weymouth, I think, Frank. You must visit Miss and Mrs. Bates. They will be glad to see you." "There is no hurry," Frank said. "Any day will do. Yes, I did meet Miss Fairfax in Weymouth. She was there with the Campbells." "Please visit the Bateses today, Frank," his father said. "Old Mrs. Bates is Jane's grandmother. Mrs. Bates and her daughter Hetty are very poor. It would be very impolite if you do not visit Jane." As Mr. Weston and his son were leaving, Emma spoke to Frank. "Jane Fairfax is a very elegant young lady," she said. "Yes, I suppose so," said Frank quietly. Emma was surprised. She had thought that a young man like Mr. Frank Churchill would be interested in the elegant and charming Miss Fairfax. Frank Churchill visited Hartfield again the next day. This time he came with Mrs. Weston. The young man seemed to like his stepmother very much. Emma was delighted. The weather that day was good. Frank, Emma, and Mrs. Weston walked in the garden at Hartfield, and then they went into the village of Highbury itself. Frank Churchill wanted to see everything, and everything in Highbury pleased him. They all stopped outside the Crown Inn. When Frank heard that the inn had a ballroom, he became very excited. He wanted to see inside the room at once. "This room is perfect for dancing," Frank Churchill said as he looked around. "We must have a ball while I am in Highbury. I am sure that there are plenty of young people here who would enjoy dancing at a ball." After several minutes, Frank, Emma, and Mrs. Weston left the inn and walked on. They were soon outside the house where Mrs. and Miss Bates lived. "Did you visit the Bateses yesterday?" Emma asked Frank Churchill. "Yes, I did," Frank replied. "I saw all three ladies, Mrs. and Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax. Miss Bates did not stop talking for more than half an hour." "Did you think that Miss Fairfax was looking well?" Emma asked. "No, I did not think that she looked well. Not well at all," Frank said quickly. "She is always pale, but now she looks ill." "Did you often see Miss Fairfax in Weymouth?" Emma asked. "Yes, I met her and the Campbells quite often," Frank replied. "And I met Mr. Dixon too, of course. He was not married to Miss Campbell then. Mr. Dixon admired Miss Fairfax, and he admired how she played the piano too. Have you heard Miss Fairfax play the piano, Miss Woodhouse?" "Yes, I have," Emma replied. "And I agree with Mr. Dixon. Miss Fairfax plays very well." "Miss Fairfax does everything extremely well," Frank said, smiling. "However, Mr. Dixon married Miss Campbell. I do not know what Miss Fairfax thought about that." "You have been Miss Fairfax's friend longer than I have." "I cannot say that I am Miss Fairfax's friend," Emma said. "She is very reserved, and it is difficult to know her. I often think that she is hiding something, that she has a secret." "I agree with you," Frank Churchill said. "It is difficult to be fond of a reserved person." Emma was very pleased with Mr. Frank Churchill. His conversation was interesting and amusing. He was charming, and he had good manners. Emma enjoyed his company, but she was very surprised when Frank went away the next day. He rode to London to have his hair cut. Mr. Weston laughed, but Mrs. Weston shook her head. Mr. Knightley had not approved of Frank Churchill from the first time that he had heard about him. When Emma told Mr. Knightley about Frank's visit to London, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "It is just as I thought. Frank Churchill is a silly, spoilt young man."